96 kilometers off the Horn of Africa coast lies a unique archipelago of Yemeni islands, the largest being Socotra, a unique island that began to form between 600 to 780 million years ago with rocks that can be traced back at least 800 million years. Socotra is a fragile record of our geological past. An alien world-looking landscape, Socotra is perhaps best known for its dragon blood trees, which have come to symbolize the island's beauty. However, this beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site, known as the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, is under threat. In 2016, Socotra became entangled in the geopolitics of the Yemen war. The United Arab Emirates seized control of the island, and through its allies, the Southern Transitional Council sought to dominate the region with potentially dire consequences for the people of Socotra. But what is the UAE doing in Socotra, and what does it mean for this ancient land? This is the war you don't see. An island abode of bliss is the Sanskrit meaning of the name Socotra. There is evidence that the island was inhabited by hominins or early humans 1.7 to 2.6 million years ago. Greek, Indian Brahmi, Southern Arabian, Ethiopic, Palmyran and Bactrian manuscripts have been found on the island, suggesting its ancient importance. A largely Christian island up until the 16th century, Socotra passed from power to power. In 880, Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia, conquered the island and the Orthodox Church was established. However, by the 9th century, Sultan Imam al-Sult bin al-Malik of Oman seized control of Socotra and made it part of his kingdom. In 1507, the Portuguese were next to take it, and they set up military bases, only to abandon them 3 years later. It was then Socotra's history with Yemen began. In 1511, the Mahara Sultans acquired administration of the island, and the inhabitants converted to Islam. Socotra's fortunes were tied to Yemen. In the 19th century, Britain took over Aden in southern Yemen, and while allowing the Maharas to retain control of Socotra, an agreement between the two meant the island was sealed off to foreign visitors. The Sultanate crumbled as Britain decided to withdraw in 1967, and Socotra was absorbed by the communist South Yemen. The Soviet Union's navy was given access, enabling them to operate in the Indian Ocean. After a bitter power struggle and the collapse of the communist Eastern Bloc countries, South Yemen reunited with North Yemen, and Socotra became part of the Yemeni Republic in 1990. In 2015, Socotra was devastated after being hit by 2 tropical cyclones within weeks of each other.
You go all the way back to 1990, there have only been 5 Category 3 or stronger cyclones like this one ever in this part of the world. So to have 2 back-to-back, unprecedented.
Hundreds were injured, thousands displaced, and much of the island, which had been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008, lay in ruins. The United Arab Emirates stepped in to provide aid and launch long-term development projects. Despite promising to rebuild homes, by 2018, none of the construction projects by the UAE had begun and another cyclone hit.
No one knows why the project has not been completed. We are average citizens attending to our cattle or fishing to earn our daily bread. Maybe the government officials know the reason, or only God knows.
Abu Dhabi's involvement on the island came months after it joined the Saudi-led coalition's war against the Houthis in Yemen. Attempting to reinstall President Abdul Rabu Mansour Hadi as leader of Yemen, Saudi Arabia mobilized 100 warplanes and 150,000 troops for the operation. The Emirates also contributed troops, and its initial entry into Socotra was partially justified as part of this campaign.
2015, after the cyclone hit, this was a great opportunity for the UAE to actually try to build a foothold by building networks. And so what the UAE usually do is they try to find a susceptible audience or community that they might engage with, and obviously doing something that we would call a counterinsurgency strategy most of the time, where you kind of build a local actor from the bottom up, where you kind of win over hearts and minds through humanitarian aid, building some infrastructure, and then on top of that, trying to build potentially a fighting force as well.
The location of Socotra and its closeness to the Bab el-Mandab Strait, a vital regional choke point, gives whoever controls the island the unique ability to influence global trade. Separating the Arabian Peninsula from the Horn of Africa, Bab el-Mandab had 6.2 million barrels of oil passing through it per day in 2018. The United Arab Emirates is a maritime power and has been opening ports and military bases across the Horn of Africa. Socotra is part of that strategy of shipping expansion. In 2018, much to the indignation of its Gulf allies, hundreds of heavily armed UAE troops arrived on Socotra Island. The Emiratis dismissed the Yemeni army and took control of a key port.
The flag of the United Arab Emirates has been raised over public buildings in Yemen's remote island of Socotra.
The Hadi administration and Saudi Arabia responded angrily, and a few weeks later, Saudi Arabia deployed a military force to the island and requested control be handed back over to the Yemeni government. The UAE agreed. 2018
was the first real surge of military UAE military equipment on the island, so that caused a lot of uproar and dissidence with islanders who obviously don't want to be pulled into that Yemen conflict. It's a peaceful island, it's not connected necessarily to the war in Yemen, and they now were sucked into this conflict because of the Emirati interests.
Despite an agreement to hand sovereignty back over to the Yemeni government, both Saudi and the UAE were still maintaining control of the island. A researcher from the Carnegie Middle East visited Socotra in 2019 and noted the second he turned on his phone after getting off the plane, he received a message welcoming him to Saudi Arabia. His phone was picking up signals from telecommunication networks operated by the Saudi military bases nearby. Locals told him Saudi set up their own networks shortly after arriving because they did not trust the UAE-owned networks already operating on the island. The Yemeni government denounced both its allies and accused them of staging a coup on the island.
The Saudi Emirati coalition alleged it had stepped in to support the legitimate government, but we all came to know that they are here for their own greedy agenda, namely to control our islands and strategic maritime routes.
What made matters worse is the United Arab Emirates' backing of a breakaway group in southern Yemen called the Southern Transitional Council, or STC. Formed in 2018, the STC sought to revive the old idea of an independent state of South Yemen. The UAE threw its weight behind them. The STC has little to do with the fight against the Houthis, who are mostly based in the north of Yemen. Saudi Arabia is fighting the Yemen war on behalf of Hadi's internationally recognized government. The UAE's backing of separatists directly undermines this. The UAE regards the STC to be more effective than the Yemeni government and saw it as an important vehicle in the south, especially with regards to Yemen's ports.
The STC, I would describe them as a very loose surrogate, but it has a clear hierarchy in a way of there's a leadership there, and that leadership has been used as well by the UAE to sell the STC overseas, sell them to Russia, sell them to Israel. Zubaydi has had meetings with a range of different international actors, makes him even a quasi quasi-state actor. He's a representative of Yemen. He sometimes has even more senior and meetings with international policymakers than Hadi.
In 2020, despite having no indigenous support, the STC launched a coup against the Yemeni government in Socotra and seized control of the island.
The STC militias have launched an all-out attack with medium and heavy weapons. They're violating state sovereignty and targeting civilians.
All ministries are now under the STC's control, and while there have been protests against their rule from locals, the UAE, despite officially withdrawing from the island, maintains military bases and props up the STC's rule.
The STC as such doesn't have any communal support in Socotra. They're not the Socotran Islanders don't feel like they're necessarily part of that southern Yemeni push. They don't kind of buy into that grievances to the same extent as other parts of southern Yemen. So the STC is an alien actor that's been imposed on them. At least that's the feeling of a majority of people in Socotra.
Last year, hundreds marched to demand UAE forces leave Socotra.
While using the STC to indirectly rule Socotra, the UAE still has a physical presence on the island and sees it as a staging ground for its wider ambitions in the region. The location of Socotra and its shipping lanes makes it very attractive to the Israelis, the Chinese, the Russians and others. The UAE hopes to capitalize on this and do deals with these countries to secure access. However, the UAE's ambitions go beyond economics.
What the Emiratis have done, they've built at least two relatively small SIGINT components, so that signal intelligence components, which are run by Emirati military officers in military uniform. So these are not contractors, these are not private commercial actors, this is the UAE military. But obviously they're not there to fight, they're there to use the island and build infrastructure that they can use for signal intelligence. Why is this important? Because Socotra, if you look at it, is a fairly mountainous island with some high elevation plateaus, which means you can actually use this very well for signal intelligence, and even going not only looking at southern Yemen but also in the Horn of Africa. Beyond that, you have it's kind of at a crossroads of undersea ocean cables. So the UAE have been tapping into these ocean cables, obviously some going into Yemen, but others also going into the Horn of Africa. So it allows the Emiratis to control information as well. They're quite advanced when it comes to cyber espionage. Some of the cables even go into Oman. So it's a way Socotra is very crucial in that respect to also tapping into information streams in this part of the world. Again, something that provides the Emiratis with immense influence and oversight. And that sort of the information that is being gathered there is important for the Israelis because they're trying to obviously control Iranian activities in that area. It's important for the Russians as well because they want to be a great power. They want to control, they want to know what's going in and out of the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea.
In 2021, reports emerged claiming the UAE was offering tourists a chance to visit Socotra. Videos, pictures, and social media posts showed Western tourists enjoying the ancient island. While they marveled at the spectacular views, the Yemeni government marveled at the spectacular loss of sovereignty and the brazenness of the Emiratis profiting from tourism. Their indignation was made worse by claims Israelis were vacationing there too, following the US's sponsored normalization deal between the UAE and Israel in 2020. Yemen's tourism ministry released a statement attacking the UAE, claiming running tour groups was part of its plans to occupy the island. For the time being, there's very little the Yemeni government can do. Despite backing from Saudi Arabia, no major power is prepared to confront the UAE over Socotra, and every country from Russia, China, France to the US has given their tacit approval for it to remain. In 2020, the UAE officially pulled out of the Yemen war, but maintains its interests in Yemen through the STC. The grab for Socotra, which happened under the guise of the Yemeni war, was in fact part of the UAE's economic strategy to move away from the petrodollar and diversify itself, which has included trying to control maritime access to ports throughout East Africa and controlling routes from Asia to Europe. Socotra will remain in the UAE's hands for the foreseeable future, much to the angst of the local population, who feel like they are being used as pawns in someone else's great game.